standpoint.
Is it time yet?
It's time.
First time for dinner.
Oh, terrific.
Faster dinner.
Donating pet food is one of the many ways you can help families in your community. Pets and people belong together. Learn more at petsandpeopletogether.org.
Okay, it is 6:30, so I'm going to call to order the annual meeting of the Oregon School District. It is Monday, September 25th, and we are here at the OSD Innovation Center. This is the annual meeting of the Oregon School District pursuant to Wisconsin Statute Section 120.08. This meeting is prescribed by state law, and electors are invited to attend. As electors, we have special powers reserved to us as a body, and these powers are outlined in the state statute. This meeting will be conducted according to the rules of parliamentary procedure. We do have an agenda for the meeting that will be our guide, and there are sample motions. It's the orange annual meeting handout right over there if you need one, and that's available for this evening. Before proceeding to item 2 on the agenda, I would like to introduce members of the Oregon School District Board of Education, and I'll start with our Vice President, Troy Pankratz. Our Treasurer, Mary Lakuta, is not able to be here this evening, so our Clerk, Anna Bijak, and then our members at large, which are Heather Garrison, Leslie Wright, and Dr. Caleb Bush. Thank you for being here. Okay, we will begin with the budget hearing pursuant to Wisconsin Statute Section 65.90. You have copies of the preliminary budget in the packet, and now I will turn it over to our Business Director, Andy Weiland, to present the preliminary budget approved by the board on September 11th, 2023. He will cover the audit, the financial report, and then present the budget. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Krista. So I'll apologize to everybody a little bit. I have a little hoarse voice, and I also have a crook in my neck. So if I'm like tilted a little bit, I apologize for that. We'll work through this though real well. The budget hearing is kind of an opportunity for people in the community to basically provide input to the budget as we go through this. It's not finalized yet. We don't actually get a chance to finalize the budget until the end of October. One of the most important dates, and we'll talk about this in a second here, is our student count date, which was actually a week ago last Friday, but we're still trying to capture that information and make sure that it's all accurate, because that is a huge component to what we do with the budget and how much we're able to tax. So we'll start with the audit and kind of a financial review of this last year. And this last year, I will say up front, was kind of an unusual year. We've had a lot of programming coming from the federal government that we've been implementing that did have an impact on our budget in a one-time positive way, we'll say. The books have been audited by Johnson & Block. We are waiting for the audit to get to us. That bound document is usually provided to us by December, and we'll do a more formal report at that point in time. But they have to have done their data review and all those types of things to certify it to the Department of Public Instruction so that they can certify our general state aid in October. So that part has been done. All right, financial report from last year. This is very, very high level. If you want more detail, there's absolutely more detail that was published in the paper as well as in the packet. But this is kind of very, very high level. From a budget perspective, last year we had a budget of just over $65 million. On the revenue side, we actually brought in over $66 million. We were off by about 2.3%. There are three main things that happened this last year that weren't anticipated when we adopted the budget that were in a positive way from a revenue perspective. One was we moved to a separate company that actually helped us bill for Medicare expenses, and that company was significantly more proficient at retaining more funds for us than the previous company, so that wasn't anticipated. Another thing that happened is a trend that you're going to see or hear in this presentation kind of all the way through, and that's interest revenue. Interest revenue, if you've been looking at your savings accounts at home, you will notice that they've gone up significantly. That has been different from about 2008 or 2009 until now. We just haven't made that much interest revenue in anything, and it kind of actually had an impact throughout our budget this last year. What we've been able to do with that interest revenue now is anticipate it and actually put it in our budget, but last year we hadn't because those trends hadn't really set in yet. So that accounts for the $1.5 million. There's one more thing I was going to mention. And special education aid did go up a little bit from the prior year. The impact of that is really related to another thing that's happened, which was ESSER federal funding. A lot of districts were using federal funding to pay for special education. Because of that, they weren't using categorical aid. And so there was more categorical aid to distribute to all the districts. And so that benefited us. And again, it wasn't anticipated. On the expenditure level, we underspent quite a bit. Part of that was a couple-fold. One is we were having trouble, like a lot of districts, to find some positions to fill, so we did have some open positions. But also, we have a tendency in our district to budget all of the expenses from prior years that weren't spent for specific things. And because those items didn't get fully implemented this last year, the funds were underspent. So there was a little bit of fund left from the last year as well. So when you add those two things together, you get an impact of the actual revenues to expenses. We did have a transfer to food service, which we anticipated this last year, but basically the fund balance did increase by about $3 million. That, again, is money that will be used for future projects this next year. It's designated, and we'll get into that next. So assigned fund balance is kind of our way to say these funds are going to be used for something in the future. They are designated for specific projects or activities, and we're holding them for those purposes. It's important to note that they are one-time in nature, And so we have to be very cognizant that we don't anticipate or use them on an ongoing basis, or we'll find ourselves in a bit of trouble, which I think a lot of school districts, unfortunately, are going to find themselves in the future. Our first thing is building carryover. That's been something that we've been doing for over 20 years. That budget or that amount of money is actually, I think, real close to what it was the prior year. So our schools basically kept about the same amount of money left over from their budgets as the prior year, maybe actually a little bit less. Departmental carryover, that's all the other departments within the district, except for the Director of Instruction. We showed that specifically. Director of Instruction's budget is doing a lot of things related to curriculum, so there was a larger amount that was related to that, and that was actually connected to our ESSER funds as well. Oregon Education Association compensation back in 2016, I believe, we passed a specific compensation system, and we've had some funds that we're kind of waiting to implement or use if the right situation for that. Grants is basically ESSER. ESSER was a major federal funding program that we had put in place. We actually have until September of 2024 to spend those dollars, and so those dollars are there for that purpose as well. Capital maintenance, this was a little bit larger than prior years. We had a number of projects that weren't fully completed this last year. Keep in mind that our fiscal year ends on June 30th. So projects such as the tennis courts, which was fairly significant. We had 2 roofing projects, one at Brooklyn and one at the middle, one actually right next door here at the field house. And another project was our solar project at our pool. All of those were not completely done yet. And so there was funding that was left over that hadn't been fully expended just because of delays or timing issues. Grow Your Own program is a program that we just started this last year to basically build our own teachers in our school district. We're trying to find innovative ways to basically help build more staffing for our district, and that was a program that we put in place to basically help people pay for college so that they could become teachers. And we have all kinds of controls to kind of work through that. And then other post-employment benefits. This was built into the referendum. We haven't implemented it yet, and so that's where those funds are. But keep in mind that number, because we're going to talk about our other post-employment benefit fund in a second, and that number will come into account. So we get to 3.93. The reason that number is larger than the prior number that I talked about is that these funds, the previous number, which was right here, was just from that 1 year. And this is combined with funds from prior years to get up to the $4 million number. So I'm going to talk specifically about a couple different funds. One of the funds is a referendum fund, which basically pays for our bonds that we use to purchase or build schools like the addition that we're in today, or like Forest Edge. The idea is that we do have approximately $2.9 million left in that fund at the end of June. We need some money to actually pay some payments in fall before we levy. You can see those payments are right there, but that still leaves us a balance. And what our intent is with that balance is to call bonds in the March of 2025 when those bonds are callable and basically save some interest. What's nice about that right now is, as I mentioned before, interest rates are very high. Our interest rate that we can invest those funds in is actually higher than what we're paying those bonds. So in the end, we'll be able to reduce some interest costs as soon as we get to those bonds being callable. This is kind of nice to not have to talk about it, but I get to talk about it one last time. Fund 38 was called our non-referendum fund, or our non-referendum debt fund. That fund is fully paid off. We have no non-referendum debt at this point in time. So there are no further obligations about that, and we won't be talking about that in the future. Our capital projects fund is the fund that we used to build Forest Edge, but there were other things in that referendum. One was security improvements and land purchases. So security improvements we've continually been doing. We also did kind of continue to do some construction items at Forest Edge this summer. One of the things was the new playground area that we put in. We had tried to grow grass for a while, and that was just not possible in that small area. We had reserved some funds for that purpose and put in a different playground surface so that the kids can not have to drag the mud in this year. We also continued a couple security improvements in the district, actually several. One was, the main one was actually replacing all our old speaker systems in our schools that did not have current speaker systems so that we could effectively communicate to everyone in the building if we needed to. And we did that, I think, in 3 or 4 different schools, as well as some additional cameras and those types of things, and some additional radios for our buildings so that we can communicate again from a safety perspective. So we hope to or plan to have the remaining funds pretty much spent down at the end of this year, but we'll see how that goes. We did take a significant chunk out of that this summer. Our food service fund is kind of a fund that's concerning to us. We had a couple things happen to us this year that have our attention. The main was the federal government kind of changed how they reimburse us for meals. They basically are heavily weighting free and reduced meals, which is a good thing, but unfortunately they took that from our paid meals reimbursements. So we do not have a large free and reduced population, so that impacted us fairly negatively, over $160,000 to $170,000 is our estimate for that. As well as just opening Forest Edge has had an impact on our cost structure. And so we are starting, and then you add the cost of food. We have had some challenges in that fund and will continue to have challenges. So we are planning to study that fund and try to see what we can do differently. But you can see at the start of the year, last year, we had about a $500,000 fund balance. And with revenue and even with the fund transfer from general fund last year that we had planned on, and our expenditures were significantly higher than our revenues, and we did reduce some of that fund balance. Unfortunately, we think that's going to exacerbate it a little bit more because of the federal changes that we talked about this last year, or that are actually being implemented this year. Our community service fund is kind of a fund that's supposed to have a zero balance at the end of each year. So we had a fund balance of $22,000. We brought in revenues of $924. Our expenditures were almost $900,000. We had a fund balance at the end that was a little bit higher that will be built into our budget for this next year. So nothing really to worry about there. We'll actually under budget revenues by the $50,000 in order to compensate for that, and again shoot for zero next year. Our OPEB, other post-employment benefits, I mentioned this briefly a second ago, well, actually a couple minutes probably. This is the fund that pays for our benefit for our retirees to have health insurance or in our district if they qualify for that benefit. And then basically we've been trying to fund that out, working actually over 20 years to try to fund that at 100%. And we are very, very close. Probably very well may likely actually achieve that this year. So like I said, for 20 years, that's been our goal. This year, we were able to actually increase our equity by more than we anticipated because of interest earnings. Interest earnings brought in over $200,000 to this fund this last year, and that really significantly propelled us forward in funding that liability. This year, we will be required, every 2 years, we're required to do an actuarial study of the fund, and we will be doing that in January, February this year, so we'll know what the liability actually is. We'll be talking about what we think the liability is right now, but we'll actually go through the whole process this year. So about $6 million in equity in that fund this year, and all of that is earning interest, which is great. We are required to talk about who invests this funds, and we use a couple different consultants, and then myself as the person that kind of manages that and makes the decision based on the consultant's recommendations. For the most part, we use PMA, the WISC series, which is Wisconsin Investment Series Cooperative, to do those things. It's a professionally managed fund to make sure that we don't lose principal if anything would happen in the economy. So here's the OPEB liability in like a 4-year trend type of thing. You can see our contribution rates have been slowly growing as our payroll has been growing. Implicit rate is kind of a goofy concept, but basically they try to have you measure basically providing benefits to older people. And that's what the implicit rate is. It's a number that goes into the calculation and then goes back out. So we kind of ignore it for the most part, but we're required to actually show it. The net effect is there. And then benefits payments, so that's money going out minus revenue that we may make, or our employees are required to make a contribution to fund this even though they're retired. So that's the net impact each year. And you can see that the net expense was only $205,000 this year's because of that higher interest revenue. And you can see then that the fund balance jumped a little bit higher than prior years because of that. And the change of fund balance going up over $500,000. Our estimated net liability in June was $1.64 million, but again, that estimate's almost 2 years old. It's a year and a half old, so we'll know where that is. If we continue on this path with interest earnings where they are and that $1 million, we could very well be fully funded when we do our study this next spring. So we also have an employee trust, which employees can basically take their sick leave and convert it at our choice. We have to choose that so there isn't tax consequences. But if we choose on their behalf that we can put the money aside for insurance benefits, we have those funds there too. So they're our employees' money, but we're holding it for them to pay basically their 10% for their insurance or to extend their benefit past what we would provide for. So you can see that we used, even though money going into that fund is based on the individual year, we also have money going out of that fund. In this last year, the impact of that fund was actually negative because more people were drawing on it than put money into it. So about 190,000, and then you'll see the 5.9 million, which is the OPEB amount. That's for everything that I had mentioned before. So that's a real quick review of our performance from the budget for this last year. I'll just quickly stop and see if there's any questions. All right, I've left an uncomfortable amount of time there for somebody to raise their hand, and no one did, so we're going to go forward to the 2003-2004 budget. Again, this budget is not fully done. We are still working on some information. We annually present this at the annual meeting. We will do that again this next year. Electors have an opportunity to be heard about the preliminary budget, and the Board of Education approves the original budget typically the fourth Monday in October. So some assumptions: our enrollment is estimated. Right now we are anticipating flat enrollment on our 3-year average. We do not have our final numbers known right now, but we anticipate being very close to that, if not slightly up. We did use the 325 base per member increase that's in the state budget, but we actually are providing that as tax relief back, and I'll talk about that in a second. We have $742 per pupil for categorical aid. That did not change, so that's just a zero impact to our budget, just based on how many students we have. We are using a modified general aid estimate from DPI. We modified it based on our actual expenditure levels. That will be certified in the middle of October. We use a special education aid proration of 33%. And equalized values, we use 15% estimate. That's probably a little low, but we wanted to be conservative at that time when we were talking about rates for everybody to look at. Couple things to keep in mind. I've mentioned this before. Carryover funds are one-time money that we're strategically allocating to projects that have a multi-year component to them, so they're not done in 1 year. Different ideas that buildings talk about for their budgets, for instance, are playground projects, computer projects, those types of things. We have a practice of budgeting these funds as an expense in the current budget. So regardless if it's a multi-year project or not, we have a practice in our district to budget them all in the 1 year so that they are accessible by the department or the school. The amount of one-time revenues we have worked with over the last year has actually been unprecedented. I've been doing this for 31 years, 25 in this district, and I've never seen the amount of one-time funding that we have gotten. It's actually become a little bit of a joke because it's really, really hard to manage that and not basically anticipate those funds continuing, but managing them so that we have them connected to one-time expenses. That has been difficult as we've gone through the pandemic, and we think we've done a really good job of that. I fear that a lot of our colleagues in other districts are going to have difficulty with that in the future. And then this is just a little bit of a commentary. Special education funding does the state does not provide an adequate amount of money for special education funding. The 33% is actually an increase from prior years. We were down to 24, 25, but the state had an excellent opportunity to increase that funding to a more acceptable level, which would have been maybe in the 40s or 50% level, and they did not do that. So we're appreciative that they've gone up to 33 from letting it drop down to in the mid-20s, but still not adequate for what we need. All right, so now we're going to take and just look at the total revenue component of what we're building into this budget. Our actual revenue last year was 67 million, just a little over that. And our preliminary budget, this is for Fund 1027, 38's kind of from our previous slide. We don't really have a Fund 38 anymore, but we included it here. It's just an $844,000 increase for 1.3. Now, I will mention that last year's revenue was really impacted by those one-time revenue sources that we had last year. And one of them, which we haven't even talked about, that people may have forgotten about, but we actually last September had a flood in one of our schools. And we actually had an insurance revenue of approximately $1 million last year related to that flood. So that's built into there, and perhaps skewing a little bit of the increase that we're anticipating on the revenue side. We've also had federal funding that was one-time in nature and that type of thing this last year. That's kind of skewing that last year's revenue number up a little bit. So this is just a graphical way to kind of look at our funding sources, and you can see that our equalization aid has been fairly flat here. Actually, everything's been flat except our operational fund levy. A little bit of that levy this year for 23-24 is a little higher than it should be, because we are going to be doing a transfer of approximately 1.3 million from that levy to our Fund 39 levy, which is our debt service, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. All right, couple things to keep in mind for our revenues. 81% of our revenues come from property tax and equalization aid, which are defined under the revenue limit. So the revenue limit really controls those expenses, and everything else is fairly minor in that regard after that, but the revenue limit is basically driven by enrollment. So how many students we have drives that number. A good portion outside of that 81% is actually open enrollment, and that is driven also by enrollment. The revenue limit is driven by a 3-year average of students, and this year we estimate that to be 0 increase. There was in the state budget a $325 per member increase for this year, and we are levying that for the education fund, but then we're transferring it to the debt service fund to provide some tax relief in that fund, so that basically the impact is that we haven't levied that money. We were the recipients of the voters of Oregon School District voted to allow us a $3 million increase in the revenue limit this year, this last November, and we are taking advantage of that. The $107,000 is a transfer service exemption in the revenue limit, and that's related to students with individual education plans that move into the school district that we had to increase staffing for this last year, and so we could claim that. We are going to take advantage of that, but similar to the $325, we are going to provide that back in the debt service fund so that we do not increase our levy by that amount in effect. Our per pupil increase was 0, as I mentioned before. That's just a categorical aid. If you would have asked me last year when we were going through the state budget, I actually thought they would have funded that way. That was kind of the party in power's primary way to fund schools. But I'll talk a little bit about what they did in a second instead of that. And the open enrollment increase also increased. The open enrollment amount actually increased a little bit as well. That's what other schools have to pay us, and then what we have to pay other schools for students. We are a positive net increase in a net open enrollment by several hundred students, so that did help us. And then ESSER has a one-time revenue of $467,000 in our budget this year. Equalization aid, this is kind of shows a story basically. Our district has continued to increase in property wealth per student, so that has changed our equalization aid and property tax percentages. You can see back in 2013, 2014, we were pretty well even. And then actually the next year, we actually were more heavily equalized aid. And then it started kind of flipping back and forth a little bit year to years. But basically, we've been slowly increasing over the last 5-6 years or so and becoming more property tax dependent and less equalization aid. That's simply because the wealth per student in our district has increased faster than other places in the state. In addition to that, the state has not put as much equalization aid into the formula, and so that reduces the amount of aid that we get as well. So on the expenditure side, last year we were at about $64 million. This year we're at $70 million, which is a $6 million increase. That seems like a lot, but keep in mind a couple things. One is, if you remember, I said before that we budget all of our carryover funds into the things. So 2/3 of that is actually just carryover. Okay, so our actual increase in reoccurring expenses is only about a little over $2 million. On the expenditure side, you can see that we are heavily weighted toward instruction, as we should be. You see that being the main increase here on the chart. A small increase on pupil services and general operations. Maintenance and operations is pretty well flat. Transportation, just a tiny increase there, and then the others are hard to show. A small increase in other, which is probably a tuition payment to other districts. Expenditures by type, again, were heavily weighted, and the referendum was really designed for salaries and benefits. So you can see that's the major two things that jump out here. Pointers don't really work very well on screens, but you can see those jumping out at you. And then transfers, that's really to our food service fund and our debt service fund, which I talked about before as a way to basically capture the flexibility that's provided to us in the state budget, but then also provide tax relief to our constituents. So our operating funds, this is kind of the point I was making before. Our revenues to expenditure budget, we are spending our fund balance or anticipating budgeting spend our fund balance, and that's why our expenditures are larger than our revenues. And then we have a couple transfers, the transfer to debt service that I've mentioned a couple times tonight, as well as our transfer to food service, continuing that for another year related to the referendum. And then a decrease in fund balance of about $4 million, which equals our carryover. Again, that's a practice that we've been doing for years, that whatever is our assigned fund balance, we actually budget that as an expense. We will not spend that full $3.9 million, but we'll spend a good portion of it, just not all of it. So we're going to talk a little bit about referendum debt, and this is actually our debt schedule for the next probably 12, 13 years. We do have principal and interest payments of $6.6 million due this next year. We'll transfer that $1.3 million, so we're only going to levy $5.2 for debt services. So we're levying it in our education area, but we're moving it to debt service so that we don't actually have an impact on that. And then we are planning to levy an additional $300,000 to take advantage of basically calling that debt in March of 2025. So our debt service schedule, I'll just point out to you very quickly, is very, very flat. We did that intentionally because we knew at some point in time we would have to grow again in our district and go to referendum. And so we didn't want to have to have an increasing fund balance or an increasing debt schedule. We wanted to be able to basically have a flat schedule so that if we added to it, the impact was just that and not what we had built into prior years. So the idea here, think I'm going to talk about this in a second, is that when we call that debt, the question that we'll work on this next year is where do we want to call that debt and where do we want to take advantage of the interest earnings that otherwise would be paid to the bondholders for that. I anticipate about $2 million being available. I'm going to jump back here. About $2 million being available to call debt in March of 2025 for that time. So where do we want to pick from these years to call that debt from? Food service, this is, I've already kind of mentioned this before. We're starting the year with $339,000 fund balance. Our budget anticipating is $1.84 million. We will bring in $110,000 from the general fund. Our expenditure budget is 2.2, so that's going to leave us probably with a zero budget at the end of this year. So we have kind of a year to figure things out, because otherwise that transfer of $110,000 will become closer to $400,000 to $500,000. Our capital projects fund, again, we're trying to fund that, spend that down. We do anticipate some interest revenue in that as well, so probably over $500,000 in expenditures this year. Our employee trust funds, again, I mentioned this in our 2022-23 recap. We have two components there, the employee trust funds and the OPEB. One is the employee trust funds is from our sick leave dollars. And we anticipate that will decrease by $20,000 again this year based on who's in there. And then the obligations, OPEB is the obligations for our retiree health plan. Kind of already mentioned that. Community ed is made up of kind of 4 segmented areas. Our pool operations, our performing arts center, which that basically just pays for part of our performing arts center director's salary. Our community education and outreach that has a lot of different programs out there, some of which do bring revenue into us. Actually, the other 2 would do as well. And then we do levy a little bit of money just to keep the building used in the weekends so that we can kind of keep an eye on things. So a small amount of money for that. This is something that we're required to do by law, is just basically, I won't read it to you, it's just a narrative for how we use our community education fund. We have to share this at the annual meeting. Our tax levy calculation then becomes kind of our operation, our referendum approved debt. We don't have non-referendum approved debt now, so it's just that one. And then our community services for a total levy of $38.9 million, $38.9 million, sorry. So then we throw that at the equalized values that we have in our district. We are anticipating, like I said before, about a 15% increase in our assessed values. That will drive the rate down based on that levy amount to 9.59, which is about a 5% reduction in the rate. This is kind of a little bit of a graphical representation of what we were talking about before. Both you can kind of see the rate continually going down, but you can also see on this chart here, 2 things kind of following each other. One is the equalized value and the property taxes. As the equalized value goes up, property taxes go up. That's by design in the state aid formula, and equalization aid being flat, if not slightly decreasing. So our all revenue budget is about $77.7 million. You'll see the components of that here, from our operating budget to our capital trust fund. That's all interest, basically. Interest revenue, our food service budget, all those added up get you there. Our expenditure budgets is a little bit larger than that. And again, that's all related, mostly related to our carryover funds that we talked about, but also spending out our capital fund, which is the fund that built Forest Edge. There's hardly any revenue there, but there's a significant amount of expenses. So you take the carryovers plus those things, and actually my favorite sheet will actually show all this together. Those excesses and increases are all netted out here, and that kind of shows you what's going on. So the general fund starting a fund balance with $17.9 million fund balance. Again, keep in mind that it is only as of July 1st of each year. If you were to look at our balances in December, early December, we're down to a couple $1 million from that $17 or $18 million number. And then you go all the way across, you see that we're actually transferring funds out of there of over $8 million is our anticipation. 6.5 going to special education. That $1.3 million going to debt service in order to lower that levy, and $110,000 going to the employee trust fund. So you'll see that we start at $18 million almost on the general fund levy or fund balance, and then by the time we're done, we're at just under $14 million. A special projects fund is really our student activity fund or our gift fund. If people give us gifts that we anticipate taking some time to spend out, we estimated at $500,000 revenue and expense. That is purely a guess on our part, but that's kind of what a budget is. Our special education fund and our general fund are both connected. So whatever we start the year at 0 and we have to end the year at 0, and really the number based on what's spent in the special education fund is then comes from the general fund to make that a 0 number. A debt service, we've talked about that before, basically keeping pretty much the same fund balance in it at the end of the year. Actually a small decrease based on bond payments. Our long-term capital improvement fund, we want to start funding that. We put some money in there to basically start a clock a few years ago, but we only have $103 in there right now. So that's something a tool that we can utilize in the future. It's kind of a sinking fund so that we can budget long-term capital projects over time. Our referendum bond fund, that's basically paying, that's really our capital project fund related to Forest Edge and the safety improvements. Our food service fund, which we've just talked about. And then our two components of our employee trust funds that you see there, both the sick leave conversion account as well as the OPEB fund. And then our community education are 4 components of that. And last but not least, we haven't talked about it all, Fund 99 is our cooperative purchases fund. That basically funds mostly the Carl Perkins federal grant for vocational education, as well as we are the administrative agent for the Badger Conference. So you can see that that anticipates a 0 impact at the end of the year with no fund balance in either of those areas. I think that concludes the presentation. So if there's any input or questions, I'm happy to answer those. Riveting, I know. There we go.
All right, thank you, Mr. Weiland. Okay, I'll entertain any questions. Also, if one more time, if anyone has any questions for Mr. Weiland. Okay, we will not take any motions at this point in time because the board does actually approve the final budget at our second meeting in October. So that's the process where we go from here for the budget. So that concludes our budget hearing. So next we move into the annual meeting. I will call that meeting to order as the president, and the first item of business is to elect a chairperson of that meeting. So I will take any nominations.
I move to nominate Krista Flanagan as chairperson of the 2023 annual meeting of the Board of Education of the Oregon School District.
Okay, do we have any other nominations to be the chair of this meeting? Okay, hearing none, then we'll close nominations and I'll entertain a motion to elect Krista Flanagan to chair this annual meeting. Is there a second? Any discussion? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Next on the item on the agenda is to appoint the parliamentarian for this meeting. So as chair, I will appoint Gina Jonan as our parliamentarian. Do you accept that role, Gina? All right, great. Okay, now moving on to adoption of ground rules. So the Oregon Board is proposing ground rules for tonight's meeting. You can find the ground rules in your packet or they're also on the table. So I will entertain a motion to adopt those ground rules.
I move to adopt the ground rules as presented in the annual meeting packet.
All right, is there a second? All right, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion on those ground rules? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? All right, motion carries. We do have ground rules. Next on the agenda is the minutes of the last annual meeting. You'll see those in your packet if you've had some time to peruse those. Because we do not have the same people here at this meeting that there were last year, we do not entertain a motion to approve those minutes. So those are just for you. Okay, so moving on to the next item on the agenda, which is the superintendent's State of the District report. So I will now invite Dr. Bergstrom to come to the podium and she will give her State of District report.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight.
I appreciate it, both the administrative team and the school board members. And actually, that's how we'll begin our state of the district, and that is by giving a well-deserved thank you to our Board of Education. They put a significant amount of time in to ensure that we are provided, or to ensure they provide the leadership that leads to a student-centered system that prioritizes not just student achievement, but also student physical and emotional well-being, while honoring the contributions of our really amazing, caring, and professional educators who make it all happen. They also understand the importance of partnering with our community and our families in our quest to meet the needs of our students. So in short, they're mission-driven people who believe in the OSD values. And our mission, and we're all grounded in that, and that is to focus on helping students acquire the skills, knowledge, and attitudes to achieve their individual potential. Now, in pursuit of our mission, which really graduation is the culminating event, although I would say that what we do in our mission extends far beyond the OSD graduation, it certainly is symbolic of a mission achieved. Our values, though, that is something that I'd really like to spend a little more time talking about, because in pursuit of our mission, in alignment with our board, our actions are driven by what we as a community value. Remember, our 5 values were developed with community input. They weren't something we just sat around in a room and decided these were the things. It was a group of community members who came together with our educators to create this. And I think that any picture of what happens in the Oregon School District really should be able to represent any one of our values, but I'll just show you what I'm thinking when I go through that. If you look at the top left, those are our OMS paraprofessionals. And I think what's really important to note is that when we are talking about caring and professional educators, we're talking about all of us. All of us who in the course of our job duties are supporting, caring for, kneeling next to our students. And that certainly includes our paraprofessional staff. The top right and the bottom right are both really indicative of the focus on the whole child and engaging students in relevant and empowering learning experiences in inclusive and equitable classrooms. And then finally, the bottom right, that's a symbol of how we partner with our community to seek solutions to problems and barriers that are ahead of us. And that is a long tradition, one in which we will continue to work for quite a while. And in addition to our OSD values, we also want to talk about our vision. And it's the portrait of a graduate, but it's rooted in the work of the school board over many, many years, and then updated with significant community input. So the roots of what you see now as Portrait of a Graduate go back to really pioneering work. And there are probably only 1 or 2 people in the room who can think back to this time, but it was really when the Oregon School District, they were pioneers in outcome-based education back in the 90s. And so board members over the years, even before we called it a whole child focus, they have led with the idea that we are trying to support students in their quest for more than credit acquisition. We're supporting students in their quest for skills and aptitudes and characteristics. So Policy 41102 was the culmination of all of that work, and it has recently been updated and now has a new title because we refreshed the 4 C's and we refreshed what was in Policy 41102 to now reflect the updated skills and characteristics that we want to be able to cultivate or nurture in an OSD graduate. And then Board Policy 41101, that outlines our high school graduation requirements, and it's represented in the component of competency. The skills and the knowledge necessary to master the standards that are the foundation of the high school credits are really starting to be built. And if you were here for our back to school assembly, this will sound familiar. These things are being built from the moment they begin their school experience. Portrait of a Graduate isn't high school work, it's system work from the very, very beginning, and it's important that we continue to emphasize that. While we're consistently striving for each and every student to meet grade level standards when we're looking at various measures of reading and math proficiency, we as a system need to improve how we are serving our multilingual learners, our students with IEPs, our students who are eligible for free and reduced meal programs, and our students of color. The students that I just mentioned, they're underrepresented in the number of students meeting proficiency. We are working actively to take specific steps to better support the learning of each and every student in the entire district, but in the groups I mentioned specifically. And we believe that an emphasis on literacy from 4K-12, supported by focused curriculum and professional development, improving the effectiveness of our PLCs, and focusing on creating inclusive classrooms and schools will make a significant difference for all students, but particularly the students in the groups that are not represented highly enough in our group of proficient students. The adoption of the EL curriculum, for example, for K through 5, that is one very specific step we are taking to address the needs of the students we are currently not serving as well as we should be. Related to character and culture, I'll just read the segment of it so everybody knows what we're talking about. Graduates will exhibit traits that build a foundation leading to success in any chosen future and contribute to a caring and inclusive community. And there are several skills and aptitudes and characteristics that are listed under character and culture, but I'm going to focus on two of them that I think are particularly important. The first is the ability to employ strategies for students to be able to support their own physical and mental wellness. I think that's a key component of what we do that is really indicative of the vision of the fact that we are about academic achievement first and foremost, but we are also about ensuring students have better lives in general. And they also have to be well enough to access all the amazing instruction that we're trying to engage them in. So once again, the district, they were pioneers, all of us, many of us were here for this, in the area of school-based mental health services. And we're continuing to prioritize supporting all aspects of student wellness. An excellent example is the increasing number of students participating in athletics. In the 17-18 school year, we had 750. In the 22-23 school year, we had 845. So we're increasing our opportunities for students to have access to building the skills that they need to be able to support their own physical and mental wellness. Whether it's school-based mental health services, it's through our curriculum, it's through participation in co-curriculars. We're intentionally building those things into their experiences. And then the second thing to emphasize under this is the idea of building empathy and seeking out and understanding the perspectives of others. Creating classrooms that are inclusive and show care to all students is an area of focus for our professional learning, for our student learning, and in the creation of learning tasks that help students work together and appreciate one another. It's central to what we do, central to the student experience. And of course, in alignment with our community values. In critical and creative thinking, first of all, this particular picture, if you didn't see it, it was on social media today, I believe. And it's pretty cool. It's a student from our advanced portfolio art class. In addition to being personally exceptionally talented, the student is pretty kind and generous. So she saw Miss Coutre prepping for class, and she offered to help by making a sample for all the introductory art students. So I think that's a really good example of not just students being creative, but also students having empathy and taking on the perspective of others. But when I think about this particular component, critical and creative thinking, which by the way is a new C of the 4 Cs, a few little things that I'll call to mind. OSD has been designated one of the best communities for music education in the nation by the NAM Foundation for the last 5 years in a row. About 380 Oregon School District students in grades 6 through 12 participated in the Wisconsin School Music Association State Solo and Ensemble Festival. We have 14 high school students this year who were nominated for a Jerry Award. And we had a number of guest composers visit the district. I'm going to keep going just for a second. Over 80 student artists from all grades and schools were featured in a district-wide art show. If you haven't had a chance to see that, you really need to. OHS art students were Badger Conference Art Challenge champions, receiving first place awards in 3D mixed media, watercolor painting, drawing, and photography. And the FES students worked with a local Madison muralist, Rodrigo Carapia, to co-create a mural of marigolds, a colorful forest, and a butterfly to represent the power and beauty of a culturally and linguistically diverse community. Now, the list was much, much longer. I just chose a few. And of course, I'm leaning into the creative, right? Because I'm talking about art, I'm talking about music. But I also want to point out that those things are intertwined. You can't have creativity without critical thinking. They are together, and they are present in science, and they are present in math just as much as they are present in music and art programming. Because we know that participating in inclusive, rigorous learning experiences based on grade level standards is an expectation for each and every student, and in part of that learning experience is the building of critical and creative thinking. Once again, key and central to what we do. And then finally, our community. This is an example of the 8th grade day at Lerner Park. For those of you who have had this really great experience, if you haven't, I recommend it. It's when all of the 8th graders come in shifts by bus with Rotarians there to guide them through different aspects of maintaining Lerner Park. And I have been involved in helping them. Really, I just watch and act encouraging as they plant new seeds, as they put in mulch for trails. And it's one example of something that's a part of who we are and what we do. And that is we partner with incredible organizations like Oregon Cares or Friends of the Oregon School District to ensure that we're creating excellent opportunities for our students. And with our families, it's the same type of partnership, right? But it's PTOs, it's volunteers. It's a participation rate of Ready, Set, Go conferences at the elementary schools of 98 to 99%. 4K community nights. I think there was over 200 attendees at our most, 250, if I remember right, attendees at our most recent one. Bringing people in, helping to make everybody feel a part of the work we do is important to our students. And that really is an area of focus for us, helping our families understand how to help their child. One action step is a website to be created to help people understand how to help their students in the new EL curriculum. Whether it's reading the same books that their child reads so that they can talk about them together, or it's helping them with vocabulary, our parents want to know what they can do as partners in their child's education. And we're working to give them more concrete information on exactly what they can do. All of the things that I just spoke about are in complete alignment with the board's three-year priorities. And you can see them here. You've seen them at every board meeting for the last year. So what we're doing, focusing in on these particular pieces, and then as a district, creating measurable goals that tell us whether or not we're making positive progress toward the board priorities. For example, it says increased academic achievement, but it's increased academic achievement through creating inclusive classrooms and rigorous instruction at grade level standards, right? It's not just increase the academic achievement, it's how are you going to do it? Supporting students physically and emotionally, their growth in both areas increases their readiness for learning. And of course, to do 1 and 2, we have to retain the amazing people we have. And when they, for life circumstances, decide it's time to leave the district, we need to be able to recruit excellent new people. And we have to be innovative in how we do it because there are great districts everywhere. So what makes us stand out? Why do people want to join this team and serve our students? That's part of what we're working on this year. Strengthening family and community partnerships, similar to what I said, people want to know how to help. We have to help them know how to help because that's what they want to be able to do for the children they love. And then finally, which I think is pretty apropos for this evening, ensuring the fiscal sustainability of the school district. How do we ensure we are on track, given the fact that there isn't necessarily a consistent way to predict our finances based on financing at the state level? And that's the state of the district.
Thank you, Dr. Bergstrom. And thank you for being our superintendent. That was an amazing report. And you're leading amazing work in this district, so thank you. Okay, moving on to old business, we have none. So we move on to new business, which are the resolutions of the evening. So you have the yellow sheet in front of you, which is the sample resolutions. So we will take up Resolution A, which is the adoption of the tax levy. At this meeting, we do need to adopt that tax levy, so I will entertain a motion.
I'll move to adopt the tax levy as follows. The irrepealable debt retirement levy of $5,200,348 and current operation and other fund levy of $33,760,478 for a total levy of $38,960,226.
Impressive. That was Heather Garrison with the motion. You can tell she was a finance major. All right, is there a second to that motion? All right, I have a second from Leslie Wright. Any discussion on the tax levy? Okay, hearing none. All those in favor of that motion, please say aye. Any opposed? All right, that motion carries. We have a total tax levy for this next year. Okay, moving on to Resolution B, which is adoption of school board salaries for 2022 and 2023. And that is also a motion in this packet, so I will entertain a motion to adopt those salaries.
I have one.
Okay, Mr. Pliner.
I move that salaries of the board members of the Oregon School District be increased by 5% over their current amounts.
Okay, we have a motion from Jim Pliner. Is there a second to that motion? All right, we have a second for Lindsay Eimerman. I knew that, sorry. All right, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion on that motion? Okay, hearing none. Oh,
I recommend board members abstain from this motion because it would be a financial gain.
yes.
So conflict of interest.
Yep. And do we, go ahead.
Correct.
Okay, so that motion is for 2023, 2024. And so I will go around to the board members who wish to abstain. Okay, all board members do indicate they will abstain from that motion. Okay, all those in favor of that motion, please say aye. Any opposed? Okay, that motion carries. Moving on to Resolution C, which is the reimbursement of board member expenses for school business, for school-related business. So we will need to adopt that authorization for that reimbursement, so I will entertain such a motion. All right, Mr. Weiland, with that motion, is there a second? All right, Lindsay with the second. Okay, any discussion on that motion?
So I recommend similarly that the board members abstain from this as well.
All right, does each board member indicate their abstention? Okay, so any further discussion on that motion? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor of that motion, please say aye. Any opposed? All right, that motion carries as well. Moving on to Resolution D, which is setting the date and the hour of the 2024 annual meeting. I will entertain that motion, and that would be the fourth Monday in September of 2024 at 6:30 p.m., which would be September 23rd. All right, we have a motion from Mr. Weiland. Is there a second? All right, we have a second from John Tanner. Any discussion on that motion? All right, hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. Okay, we are done with our resolutions for the evening, so that leaves one more motion, which is adjournment. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn the annual meeting. That motion is by Heather Garrison. Is there a second? All right, second by Leslie Wright. All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? All right, that motion carries. We are adjourned at 7:31. Thank you, everyone.